a rare and disturbing photo of slavery in 1850s, Louisiana you've never seen before. The discovery, Dr. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as she carefully lifted the daguerreotype from its protective case. The photograph, no larger than her palm, had been hidden away in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society for over a century, misfiled among routine plantation records and forgotten until now. As a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana, she had seen countless images from the slavery era, but this one was different, disturbingly, hauntingly different. The image showed a group of enslaved people standing in what appeared to be a sugar plantation's courtyard. But it wasn't a typical posed photograph that plantation owners commissioned to showcase their property. This daguerreotype captured something raw, unfiltered, and deeply unsettling. The expressions on the faces of the enslaved individuals weren't the forced compliance usually demanded for such photographs. Instead, there was something in their eyes, a mixture of defiance, desperation, and an almost prophetic awareness that this moment would outlive them all. Sarah had been working late in the archives when she stumbled upon the photograph, tucked between the pages of an 1854 ledger from Bellemont Plantation in St. Charles Parish. The ledger itself was unremarkable, typical entries recording the purchase of supplies, weather conditions, and crop yields. But this photograph was an anomaly, a crack in the carefully constructed narrative that plantation owners had tried to preserve for posterity. The daguerreotype bore no photographer's mark, no date, no identifying information, except for a small notation on the back, written in faded ink. The truth, they don't want remembered, M.D. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, as if the writer had been afraid of being discovered. As Sarah Sayin examined the image under the magnifying glass, details emerged that made her stomach clench. The clothing of the enslaved people was more tattered than what was typically allowed for photograph. Their positioning seemed natural rather than arranged, suggesting they might not have been aware they were being photographed. Most disturbing of all, in the background, partially obscured by shadows, there appeared to be evidence of recent violence, dark stains on the ground, and what looked like restraints hanging from a nearby tree. This was a shocking historical evidence that has remained hidden for over 270 years. The complete analysis reveals details that will change how you view American history forever. Sarah's discovery would soon unravel a story that had been deliberately buried, involving not just the brutal realities of slavery in Louisiana's sugar parishes, but a conspiracy of silence that reached into the highest levels of antebellum society. This photograph wasn't just a historical artifact. It was evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted, testimonies that had never been heard, and truths that powerful people had gone to great lengths to suppress. The Louisiana sugar parishes in the 1850s were among the most brutal environments for enslaved people in the entire South. Unlike cotton plantations, sugar production required year-round labor under conditions that were often deadly. The mortality rate among enslaved people on sugar plantations was significantly higher than on cotton plantations, with many not surviving their first year of labor. The wealth generated by these plantations was immense, but it came at a human cost that was carefully hidden from the outside world. Bellemont Plantation, where this photograph was taken, was owned by the Rousseau family, French Creoles, who had built their fortune on sugar and the labor of enslaved people. Pierre Rousseau, the plantation's owner in 1853, was known for his cruelty even by the standards of his time. Former enslaved people who escaped to freedom often spoke of Bellemont as a place where people went to die, where the overseer's whip was never silent, and where the most minor infractions were met with punishments that defied human decency. But who was and why had they risked everything to document what they had witnessed? Sarah's investigation would reveal that these initials belonged to someone whose very existence challenged everything historians thought they knew about the antebellum South and the people who lived through its horrors. 3 weeks of intensive research led Sarah to a breakthrough that would redefine her understanding of the photograph. M.D. was not a plantation owner. overseer or visiting dignitary as she had initially suspected. The initials belonged to Marie Dufresne, a free woman of color who had worked as a seamstress for the Rousseau family and had somehow gained access to photographic equipment, an almost impossible feat for someone of her social standing. Marie's story emerged from a collection of letters discovered in the attic of a Creole family in New Orleans, letters that had been preserved by accident rather than design. Born in 1825 to an enslaved mother and a French planter who had freed her upon his death, Marie occupied the precarious position of a free person of color in a society that viewed her very existence as a threat to the established order. The letters revealed that Marie had learned photography from Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, Pierre's younger brother, who had studied the art in Paris before returning to Louisiana. Jean-Baptiste was described in family correspondence as troubled by the peculiar institution and had apparently taught Marie the daguerreotype process in secret, providing her with equipment and chemicals under the pretense that she was learning to help him document the Tamentation's buildings and grounds. But Marie had other plans. The letters, written to her sister in New Orleans, spoke of her determination to capture the truth that no one wants to see and her belief that someday these images will speak when we no longer can. She had been systematically documenting the conditions at Bellemont, creating a visual record of the brutality that plantation owners worked so hard to conceal. The photograph that Sarah had discovered was part of a larger collection that Marie had hidden throughout the plantation ground. According to her letters, she had buried several daguerreotypes in sealed containers, marking their locations with seemingly innocent symbols carved into trees and fence posts. The photograph in the archives was likely one that she had managed to smuggle out before her activities were discovered. Marie's final letter, dated October 1823, was chilling in its prescience. They suspect what I have been doing. Pierre's overseer has been asking questions about missing chemicals, and I fear my time here is short. If something happens to me, know that I have hidden the truth where they will never think to look. The dead will speak for those who cannot. The hidden cache of photographs that Marie Dufresne buried contains evidence so shocking that it would have sparked a revolution if discovered. Find out what other secrets lie buried in Louisiana soil. Historical records showed that Marie Dufresne disappeared from Bellemont Plantation in November. The official explanation was that she had returned to New Orleans to care for a sick relative, but no record of her arrival in the city existed. More ominously, Jean-Baptiste Rousseau left Louisiana abruptly around the same time, never to return. Family letters suggested that he had been overcome with grief and guilt and had fled to Europe, where he lived in self-imposed exile until his death. The photograph that Sarah had discovered showed the aftermath of what Marie's letters described as the Punishment Day, a monthly ritual at Bellemont, where enslaved people who had committed infractions were publicly punished as an example to others. The dark stains, visibly in the background, were likely blood, and the restraints hanging from the tree had been used for whippings that often resulted in permanent disability or death. But the most disturbing aspect of the photograph wasn't what it showed, it was what it represented. This was evidence of systematic torture and murder that had been carefully hidden from the outside world. The enslaved people in the photograph weren't just victims, they were witnesses to crimes that would never be prosecuted, survivors of a Holocaust that history had sanitized and romanticized. Marie Dufresne's courage in documenting these atrocities came at the ultimate cost. Her disappearance was almost certainly not voluntary, and her fate served as a warning to anyone else who might consider exposing the truth about plantation life. Yet their photographs survived, hidden testimonies waiting for someone brave enough to bring them to light. As Sarah delved deeper into the history of Bellemont Plantation, a picture emerged of systematic brutality that exceeded even her worst expectations. The plantation records, when cross-referenced with Marie Dufresne's letters and the photographic evidence, revealed an operation that was less as agricultural enterprise than it was a death camp disguised as a business. Pierre Rousseau had inherited Bellemont from his father in 1845, along with 38,45 hectares of prime sugar-growing land. Within 8 years, the enslaved population had dropped to 19 population, despite the purchase of 89 additional people during that period. This meant that over 200 enslaved people had died at Belmont in less than a decade, a mortality rate that was shocking even by the brutal standards of Louisiana sugar plantations. The plantation's overseer, a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, was described in contemporary accounts as a demon in human form. Blackwood had been hired by Pierre Rousseau specifically for his reputation for maintaining discipline, euphemism for his willingness to use extreme violence to maximize productivity. Under his supervision, Belmont became known throughout the region as a place where troublesome, enslaved people were sent to be broken. Marie's letters provided horrifying details about daily life under Blackwood's regime. Enslaved people were awakened at 4 a.m. and worked until after dark, with only brief breaks for minimal meals. Those who showed signs of exhaustion or illness were subjected to motivational treatments that included whippings, brandings, and confinement in underground cells that flooded during heavy rain. The photograph captured one of Blackwood's punishment days, monthly spectacles designed to terrorize the enslaved population into absolute submission. These events were carefully choreographed displays of violence that served multiple purposes. They eliminated those deemed unproductive, provided entertainment for Rousseau and his guests, and sent a clear message to survivors about the consequences of resistance. According to Marie's documentation, punishment days followed a ritualistic pattern. Enslaved people accused of infractions, which could be anything from working too slowly to looking at a white person the wrong way, were brought to the plantation's courtyard before dawn. They were forced to watch as their fellow captives were subjected to increasingly severe punishments, creating a psychological torture that was often worse than the physical abuse. The detailed records of these punishment rituals reveal a level of systematic cruelty that most Americans have never learned about. Discover the full extent of what really happened on Louisiana's sugar plantation. The photograph showed the aftermath of one such event, with the surviving enslaved people still gathered in the courtyard. Their faces told the story that plantation records never could. The trauma, the terror, and the desperate hope that somehow someone would bear witness to their suffering. Marie Dufresne had provided that witness, risking everything to ensure that these crimes would not be forgotten. But Belmont's horrors extended beyond the punishment days. Marie's letters describe a plantation hospital that was actually a place where enslaved people were taken to die, often after being subjected to medical experiments by a doctor who visited monthly from New Orleans. She wrote about children as young as 8 being forced to work in the sugar mill, where accidents were common and often fatal. She documented the systematic rape of enslaved women by Rousseau, Blackwood, and their guests, and the murder of any children born from these assaults who showed signs of their white parentage. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Marie revealed that Belmont was part of a network of plantations that shared information about effective disciplinary techniques. Rousseau regularly hosted gatherings where plantation owners and overseers exchanged methods for maximizing productivity through terror. These meetings, disguised as social events, were actually conferences on the science of human degradation. The wealth generated by this system was staggering. Belmont produced over 800 hogsheads of sugar annually, generating profits that allowed Rousseau to maintain homes in New Orleans and Paris, send his children to European schools, and live a lifestyle of luxury that was built entirely on human suffering. The contrast between the opulence of the plantation house and the squalor of the slave quarters was a deliberate reminder of the power dynamic that governed every aspect of life at Belmont. Yet, for all its horrors, Belmont was not unique. Marie's letter suggested that similar conditions existed on dozens of plantations throughout Louisiana's sugar parishes. The photograph she had taken was not evidence of an isolated atrocity, but documentation of a system of oppression that was far more extensive and brutal than most Americans. Sarah's investigation into the Belmont photograph led her to uncover a vast conspiracy that extended far beyond a single plantation. The systematic suppression of evidence about the true conditions of slavery in Louisiana involved not just plantation owners, but politicians, journalists, religious leaders, and even some abolitionists who feared that the full truth would be too shocking for the public to accept. The conspiracy began with the plantation owners themselves, who understood that their wealth depended on maintaining a carefully crafted public image. They commissioned photographers to create sanitized images of plantation life, showing well-dressed enslaved people in clean quarters engaged in light work under benevolent supervision. These propaganda photographs were distributed to newspapers in the North and to European investors, creating a false narrative that portrayed slavery as a paternalistic institution that benefited everyone involved. But the conspiracy went much deeper than simple propaganda. Sarah discovered evidence that the plantation owners had systematically bribed the government officials to suppress reports of excessive mortality rates among enslaved people. When federal census takers visited plantations, they were often shown fabricated records and prevented from speaking directly with enslaved people. Those who attempted to document the true conditions faced threats, violence, and in some cases mysterious disappearance. The Catholic Church, which had significant influence in Louisiana, played a particularly troubling role in the conspiracy. Rather than speaking out against the brutality they witnessed, many priests provided religious justification for slavery and actively helped plantation owners suppress evidence of their crimes. Church records from the period show that priests were regularly paid by plantation owners to provide spiritual guidance that emphasized obedience and acceptance of suffering as God's will. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some northern abolitionists were complicit in the cover-up. While they publicly opposed slavery, they privately worried that revealing the full extent of plantation brutality would be counterproductive to their cause. They feared that northern audiences would be so horrified by the truth that they would dismiss it as exaggerated propaganda, undermining the credibility of the entire abolitionist movement. The network of complicity that kept this horrors hidden involved some of the most respected names in American history. Learn which prominent figures knew the truth but chose to remain silent. Sarah found evidence of this conspiracy in the personal papers of several prominent abolitionists, including letters that discussed the need to moderate our revelations and present slavery's evils in terms that Christian consciences can accept. These documents reveal the calculated decision to focus on the moral arguments against slavery while downplaying the most extreme examples of physical brutality. The conspiracy extended into the post-Civil War period when the federal government had opportunities to investigate and prosecute war crimes committed on plantations like Belmont. Instead, the focus on reconciliation and healing the nation meant that most plantation owners faced no consequences for their actions. Many simply transitioned from owning enslaved people to exploiting sharecroppers and convict laborers, continuing their patterns of abuse under new legal frameworks. Pierre Rousseau himself exemplified this continuity of oppression. After the Civil War, it transformed Belmont into a sharecropping operation that trapped former enslaved people in cycles of debt and dependency that were often worse than slavery. When that system was challenged by Reconstruction-era reforms, it pivoted to using convict labor, essentially purchasing enslaved people from the state prison system. He died in 1891, wealthy and respected, having never faced justice for the hundreds of people who had died under his authority. The conspiracy also involved the systematic destruction of evidence. As the Civil War approached and it became clear that slavery might be abolished, plantation owners throughout Louisiana organized massive document burning campaigns. They destroyed the records that might implicate them in crimes, eliminated photographs that showed the true conditions of plantation life, and intimidated or eliminated witnesses who might testify against them. Marie Dufresne's photographs survived only because she had hidden them so well and because the conspiracy was not aware of their existence. Her disappearance was likely the result of suspicions about her activities, but the conspirators never found her hidden cache of evidence. The photograph that Sarah discovered in the archives had probably been smuggled out by Jean-Baptiste Rousseau before he fled to Europe. Hidden among routine plantation documents, where it remained unnoticed for over a century. The scope of this conspiracy helps explain why so many Americans today have such a sanitized understanding of slavery. The true history was deliberately suppressed by people who had the power to shape the historical record, creating a version of events that minimized the horror and emphasized the supposed benefits of the peculiar institution. This false narrative became so entrenched that even today, many history textbooks present slavery in terms that would have been recognizable to the conspirators who worked so hard to hide the truth. The most haunting aspect of Sarah's discovery was not just the photograph itself, but the realization that it represented voices that had been silenced for over. As she studied the faces in the daguerreotype, she began to see them not as anonymous victims, but as individuals with names, stories, and families who had been systematically erased from the historical record. Using plantation records, slave narratives from other Louisiana plantations, and genealogical research, Sarah began the painstaking process of identifying the people in Marie Dufresne's photograph. The central figure, a man in his 30s with scars visible on his arms and face, was likely Samuel, described in plantation records as a field hand of rebellious disposition, who had been purchased from a plantation in Mississippi after attempting to escape multiple times. The woman standing to his left, holding the hand of a small child, was probably Celeste, a house servant who had been born at Bellemont and had watched her parents die under Blackwood's regime. Plantation records noted that she had given birth to 4 children, but only one had survived past infancy, likely the child visible in the photograph. The others had died from disease, malnutrition, or violence, their deaths recorded in plantation ledgers with the same casual notation used for livestock losses. Behind them stood an elderly man whose posture suggested both dignity and resignation. This was probably Jupiter, a skilled carpenter who had been at Bellemont for over 20 years and had become a leader among the enslaved community. His advanced age was remarkable on a plantation where most people died before reaching 40, and his survival likely depended on his valuable skills and his ability to navigate the dangerous politics of plantation life. Each face in the photograph told a story of survival against impossible odds. These were people who had endured daily brutality, who had watched friends and family members die, who had been stripped of their names, their cultures, and their humanity, yet who had somehow maintained their dignity and their hope for freedom. The photograph captured them in a moment of profound vulnerability, but also of quiet resistance. Their very survival was an act of defiance against a system designed to destroy them. The individual stories of the people in this photograph reveal the human cost of slavery in ways that statistics never could. Discover how researchers are working to restore the names and histories of those who were deliberately forgotten. Sarah's research revealed that the photograph had been taken shortly after one of Bellemont's most brutal punishment days. According to Marie's letters, 3 people had died during the October 1853 event, including a teenage boy who had been accused of stealing food to feed his sick mother. The survivors in the photograph had been forced to watch these executions, then to dispose of the bodies in unmarked graves in the plantation's backfields. The psychological trauma visible in their faces was the result of what we would now recognize as systematic torture designed to break the human spirit. They had been subjected to techniques that were specifically designed to create learned helplessness, to convince them that resistance was futile, and that their only choice was absolute submission. Yet the photograph also captured something that their tormentors had failed to destroy, a spark of humanity that refused to be extinguished. Marie Dufresne's letters provided additional context about the people in the photograph. She wrote about Samuel's attempts to teach other enslaved people to read, despite the severe punishments that awaited anyone caught with written materials. She described Celeste's efforts to keep traditional African songs and stories alive, passing them down to the children in whispered conversations after dark. She documented Jupiter's role as a spiritual leader, conducting secret religious services that blended Christian and African traditions. These acts of cultural preservation were forms of resistance that plantation owners feared almost as much as physical rebellion. They understood that maintaining cultural identity and community bonds made enslaved people harder to control, which is why such activities were punished with extreme violence. The fact that these traditions survived at all was a testament to the courage and determination of people like those captured in Marie's photograph. The photograph also revealed the intergenerational nature of plantation trauma. The child in the image, probably no more than 6 years old, already showed signs of the psychological damage that came from growing up in an environment of constant terror. Yet children like this also represented hope. They were the future that enslaved people were fighting to protect, the reason that parents endure unimaginable suffering rather than give up. Sari's investigation uncovered evidence that some of the people in the photograph may have survived the Civil War and Reconstruction. Freedmen's Bureau records from Charles Paris included references to individuals with names and descriptions that matched some of the figures in Marie's daguerreotype. If these connections were accurate, it meant that at least some of these voices from the grave had lived to see freedom, had testified about their experiences, and had tried to ensure that the truth about places like Belmont would not be forgotten. After months of research, Sarah Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at Tulane University, preparing to present her findings about the Belmont photograph to a gathering of historians, journalists, and descendants of both enslaved people and plantation owners. The image that had been hidden for over 160 years was finally going to be revealed to the world. Along with the story of the conspiracy that had kept it secret, the presentation began with the photograph itself, projected onto a large screen that allowed the audience to see details that had been invisible to previous generations. Sarah explained how she had discovered the daguerreotype, the process of identifying Marie Dufresne as its creator, and the painstaking research that had revealed the true conditions at Belmont Plantation. The audience sat in stunned silence as she described the systematic brutality, the conspiracy of silence, and the courage of one woman who had risked everything to document the truth. But Sarah's presentation was about more than historical revelation. It was about the ongoing impact of these hidden truths on contemporary America. She explained how the conspiracy to suppress evidence of plantation brutality had shaped the historical narrative that most Americans learned in school, creating a sanitized version of slavery that minimized its horrors and obscured its lasting effects. This false narrative had made it easier for subsequent generations to ignore the systemic racism that grew out of slavery and to resist efforts at meaningful reconciliation and justice. The photograph and Marie's letters provided evidence that the brutality of slavery was far worse than most Americans had been taught to believe. The systematic torture, murder, and psychological warfare documented at Belmont was not an aberration. It was the logical extreme of a system that treated human beings as property. Understanding this truth was essential for understanding why the effects of slavery continued to shape American society more than. Sarah's research here had also revealed the names and stories of some of the people in the photograph, transforming them from anonymous victims into individuals whose lives and suffering matter. She had worked with genealogists and community historians to trace the descendants of Belmont's enslaved population, many of whom still lived in Louisiana and had family stories that corroborated the evidence in Marie's documentation. During the representation, Sarah revealed a particularly significant discovery that had emerged from her collaboration with local communities. Working with the descendants of enslaved people from Belmont, she had located what appeared to be one of Marie Dufresne's burial sites. Using ground-penetrating radar and careful archaeological techniques, they had uncovered a sealed container that held not only additional photographs, but also a detailed journal that Marie had kept during her final months at the plantation. This journal provided unprecedented insight into the daily operations of Belmont and the psychological state of both the enslaved people and their oppressors. Maria documented conversations with enslaved people who spoke of their dreams of freedom, their strategies for survival, and their determination to preserve their humanity despite the dehumanizing conditions they faced. She had also recorded overheard conversations among the plantation's white residents, revealing the casual cruelty and calculated brutality that characterized their approach to managing human property. Perhaps most remarkably, the journal contained detailed maps that Marie had drawn, showing the locations of unmarked graves throughout the plantation grounds. These maps suggested that hundreds of enslaved people had been buried in secret locations, their deaths hidden from official records to avoid scrutiny from authorities. Sarah's team had begun the process of locating and documenting these burial sites, working with descendant communities to ensure that proper respect was paid to the remains of those who had suffered and died at Bellemont. The complete collection of Marie Dufresne's hidden photographs has been recovered, revealing evidence that will fundamentally change how American slavery is taught and understood. See the full archive that has remained buried for over a century. The presentation concluded with the announcement that Sarah and her team had located and excavated several of Marie Dufresne's hidden caches, recovering additional photographs and documents that provided even more evidence of the systematic brutality that characterized the Louisiana sugar plantation. These materials would be preserved in a new archive dedicated to telling the complete truth about slavery, ensuring that voices like Marie's would never again be silenced. The audience response was immediate and powerful. Descendants of enslaved people spoke about how the photographs validated family stories that had been dismissed as exaggerated or impossible. Historians acknowledged that the evidence forced them to reconsider their understanding of slavery's brutality and its lasting impact. Even descendants of plantation owners expressed support for revealing the truth, recognizing that healing could only come through honest acknowledgement of the past. But the presentation also generated controversy. Some audience members argued that revealing such disturbing evidence would be counterproductive, that it would increase racial tensions rather than promote healing. Others questioned whether the photographs were authentic, despite the extensive documentation that Sarah had provided. These reactions demonstrated how deeply the conspiracy of silence had shaped American consciousness, making it difficult for some people to accept evidence that challenged their fundamental beliefs about the past. In the weeks following the presentation, Sarah's discovery generated national attention. Major newspapers ran stories about the hidden photographs, television documentaries were commissioned, and museums began planning exhibitions that would present the complete truth about slavery's brutality. The photograph that had been hidden for over 160 years became a catalyst for a broader conversation about how America remembers its past and confronts its ongoing legacy of racial injustice. The impact of Sarah's work extended beyond academic circles. Educational institutions began revising their curricula to include more accurate representations of slavery's brutality, and community organizations used the photographs and documents to support reparations initiatives and other efforts to address the ongoing effects of historical injustice. The evidence that Marie Dufresne had risked her life to preserve was finally serving its intended purpose, forcing America to confront the truth about its past and take responsibility for its continuing legacy. Marie Dufresne's courage in documenting the truth had finally been vindicated. Her photographs had survived the conspiracy that killed her, outlasted the system that they documented, and emerged at a time when America was finally ready to confront the full truth about its history. The faces in her daguerreotype, Samuel, Celeste, Jupiter, and the unnamed child, had finally found their voices, speaking across the centuries to demand that their suffering be acknowledged and their humanity be recognized. The discovery of the Bellemont photograph was more than a historical revelation. It was a moral reckoning. It forced Americans to confront the reality that their nation's wealth and power had been built on a foundation of systematic torture and murder, and that the effects of this violence continued to shape contemporary society. Only by acknowledging this truth could the country begin the work of genuine healing and justice that had been delayed for far too long. As Sarah concluded her research and prepared to publish her findings, she reflected on the power of a single photograph to change history. Marie Dufresne had understood that images could speak when voices were silenced, that truth could survive even the most determined efforts to suppress it. Her legacy was not just the photographs she had hidden, but the reminder that bearing witness to injustice, no matter the cost, was both a moral obligation and an act of hope for future generations who would inherit the consequences of silence or the possibilities of truth. The rare and disturbing photograph of slavery in 1850s, Louisiana had finally been seen, and this revelation ensured that the voices of the enslaved would never again be forgotten or ignored. In preserving their images, Marie Dufresne had preserved their humanity, and in discovering her work, Sarah Mitchell had helped restore their place in the historical record where they rightfully belonged. This story, while fictional, is based on extensive historical research about the conditions of slavery on Louisiana sugar plantations and the systematic efforts to suppress evidence of the brutality that characterized the institution of slavery in the American South. The characters and specific events are imagined, but they reflect the documented historical realities that have often been overlooked or minimized in popular understanding of American history.